Thank you.
Center.
No more jokes.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's program, Kahn and Ford with Mike Skinner. I'm Risha Ring and I am the president of the Jewish Historical Society. And we thank the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation for partnering in tonight's program. A special welcome to the members of the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation who are joining us in supporting this evening's program. If you're new to JHSM, and we are so glad that you're here. Jewish Historical Society has been around since 1959. We are a statewide organization. We offer interesting programming and award-winning publications. We're currently undergoing a feasibility study for the possibility of opening up a Jewish museum in Michigan. Our events coordinator, Kara Schuchman, will share some of our upcoming events and do some housekeeping. But if you have never seen Mike Skinner, or you never met him, he's one of the most enthusiastic conversationalists. I can't wait to hear him speak about something that he's so passionate about. So welcome and thank you for coming. And Kara?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Kahn and Ford. I just wanted to let you know of our upcoming programs. We have a number of exciting opportunities for you to join with JHSM. On March 21st, we are going to hear from Ashley Johnson-Bavery with Unauthorized Immigration and Jewish Detroit. On March 23rd, we have an exciting fundraiser with Steve's Deli. If you eat in Steve's Deli, dine in or carry out, you will be able to have the proceeds from that day go to JHSM. No registration is necessary. On April 12th, we will be hearing from Pamela S. Nadell on American anti-Semitism, an old problem returns. And we have our first in-person lecture and program at Beth Am Synagogue on April 25th. We will be discussing the book, The Women of Copper County, and hearing from some of our out-state friends on the Jewish implication in that. As always, all of our programs are sponsored by the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts. And if you wish to register for any of the programs above, please scan the QR code on your screen, and that will take you right to the website. Another housekeeping item, we know that this is going to be a really exciting and informative presentation. And if you have any questions, we ask that you submit them via the chat feature on your Zoom screen, and we'll be moderating a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. We'll try and get to as many questions as possible, but there are over 300, 400, 500 people registered for tonight. And so we may not be able to get to all of them, but we will be sharing Mike Skinner's contact information. So if we don't get to your question, I will send an email tomorrow with that so you can contact him. And right now I'm going to turn it over to JHSM Vice President Barbara Cohen, who will be introducing tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Kara. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing Mr. Mike Skinner. Mike has been a member of the Board of Trustees at the former Ford Piquette Avenue Plant since 2000. He has been a member of the Model T Ford Club of Detroit for more than 30 years and is a founding member of the Piquette T's Model T Ford Club. He is also a founding member of the Henry Ford Heritage Association and served as president there from 2000 to 2007. He has been a tour guide at Fairlane since 1977, the home of Clara and Henry Ford. Mike has also served as president of both the Dearborn and the Grosse Pointe Historical Societies. Tonight he speaks to us on Kahn and Ford, so please join me in welcoming friend to many, Mike Skinner.
Can you see my screen?
We cannot see it yet. You'll have to share it again.
Yep, I apologize. All right. Let me come back to. With that, here we go. I'm so sorry. After that practice session, I thought everything was going to go perfectly. What are we seeing now?
We are seeing exactly what you see. Now we see your presentation.
All right, I'm so sorry. Tonight's program is called Kahn and Ford, but it is based on a program that was called Ford and Kahn. Let me just explain that, and you'll understand it in just one moment. Albert Kahn is often referred to as the world's greatest industrial architect, having earned that distinction, some say, in significant part because of his work with Henry and Edsel Ford and the Ford Motor Company. Mr. Kahn and his firm designed 1,069 buildings for Ford Motor Company by the time of Mr. Kahn's death in 1942. Today, we'll examine the relationship between Henry Ford and Mr. Kahn and touch on Mr. Kahn's friendship with Edsel Ford. The initial basis of this presentation was a slideshow that University of Michigan professor Dr. David O. Lewis created around the time that his article, Ford and Kahn, appeared in the September-October 1980 issue of Michigan History magazine, shown here. I'm proud to say that David Lewis has forgotten more about Ford than I will ever know, and I have been friends for 45 years. Dr. Lewis, who will be 95 on April 5th, sends his regrets for not being able to participate this evening. Thus, I'm representing this program on his behalf. Dr. Lewis allowed me to use Ford and Kahn program previously in 2009 for a joint Edsel and Eleanor Ford House and Grosse Pointe Historical Society program commemorating the centennial of Mr. Kahn's initial Ford project, the first Ford Motor Company building in Highland Park, and Mr. Kahn's relationship with Edsel Ford. At that time, I added an extensive section about Kahn's decades on the Arts Commission, Detroit Arts Commission, with Edsel Ford and his design of the Gawker Point Mansion, now known as the Edsel and Eleanor Ford House. I also added a list of and photos of the 17 homes and commercial buildings that Mr. Kahn designed in the Grosse Pointes. Ladies and gentlemen, that 2009 program ran 90 minutes. Thus, this evening, I've returned to a program relating primarily to Henry Ford and Albert Kahn with the plan to finish in an hour, I promise, including a question and answer session at the end. So let's get started. Henry Ford was born July 30th, 1863. His only son and only child, Edsel, was born November 6th, 1893. And here you see the two of them. Less than 6 years after Mr. Ford's birth, Albert Kahn was born on March 21st, 1869, near Frankfurt, Germany. At an early age, Mr. Kahn learned to play the piano with such exceptional skill that he was considered a child prodigy. But piano lessons and all formal schooling ended with his family's move to Detroit in 1880 when Mr. Kahn was 11 years old. And here you see the family. In Detroit, the artistically talented but amazingly colorblind young Albert, the oldest of 8 children, had to work at odd jobs to help supplement the large family's meager income since his father, who was trained as a rabbi, could not secure a steady position. As a teenager, Mr. Kahn secured a job at the architectural firm of Mason and Rice. In 1890, when he was 21 years of age, Albert Kahn was awarded a $500 travel scholarship from the American Architect and Building News magazine. The last 3 months of this European tour were in the company of Henry Bacon, who would go on to design the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Bacon was so helpful that Mr. Kahn referred to this period as, quote, my formal education in architecture. After this European excursion, Mr. Kahn returned to the office of Mason and Rice, where he remained until 1895, when he started his own business. Soon after founding his firm, his brother Julius developed a new style of construction where reinforced concrete replaced wood in factory floors, roofs, and supports. Julius then founded the Trust Concrete Steel Company. And here you see from my collection a piece of stationery from that company. Here you also see another postcard from that company talking about the first building that we're going to be covering in just one second. This new type of construction provided improved fire protection, allowed for great volumes of unobstructed interior space and large exterior windows. Here we see the Ford Highland Park complex at its peak. When Mr. Kahn began his career, architects focused primarily on the design of museums, libraries, monuments, hotels, mansions, and the like. Factory design they felt was beneath their dignity, but Mr. Kahn eagerly accepted factory commissions. He once said, quote, when I began, the real architects would design museums, cathedrals, capitals, monuments. The office boy was considered good enough to do the factory buildings. I'm still the office boy designing factories. I have no dignity to injure, unquote. His factory work seems to have begun with a plan for a small factory for Detroit's Boyer Machine Company in 1900. This assignment was followed by a commission that determined the future course of his career, the design of a plant for Detroit's Packard Motor Car Company. Over a 2-year period, Mr. Kahn designed 10 buildings for Packard, the last of them Detroit's first reinforced concrete structure, shown here and known as Packard Unit Number 10. In 1904, Motor Age magazine indicated of the Packard plant, quote, the bright, clean, and cheerful aspects of the different departments. It is one of the new style of factories that are gradually displacing the old prison workshops, which especially in cities and sadly enough were common in all industries until the last decade. It is most fitting that the automobile industry, as the newest great industry of our country, should in its new factories add to the strength of the movement towards a rational working place, unquote. At the time of his call to Mr. Kahn, Mr. Ford knew that the 67,000 square foot Piquette Avenue plant in Detroit, where the Model T was first designed and assembled, could not meet the company's future needs. Even with the addition of these buildings that you see here, the 3.11 acre site on Piquette was far too small. This view of the factory's interior, and it's only 56 feet wide and 302 feet long, shows why. The building was designed by Field, Hinchman, and Smith, and now the group known as the Smith Group. This plant was purchased in 2000 by a nonprofit organization formed by a group of auto history enthusiasts. I'm a member of this group, as mentioned before, and I've served on the board of trustees since the building was acquired. It is a museum and site of many tours. Here we see a group in the 1914 Model T that visitors can sit in. We had 31,000 visitors in 2018 and 19, and we have had people from 93 countries. I'm getting old and don't understand these destination weddings, but thank God they occur. This photo was taken shortly after I'd driven this couple from the Little Rock Baptist Church in my 1921 Model T, seen behind them for their reception. This Model T, by the way, belonged for 34 years to David Lewis. And here we see the reconstruction of Henry Ford's office at Piquette, where Mr. Kahn met with James Couzens and Henry Ford. The Ford and Kahn relationship began with a call from Henry Ford to the architect in 1908 from this office that resulted from what Henry Ford had heard about the Packard plant design. Mr. Kahn, and now this is Mr. Kahn repeating this to a friend later. Mr. Kahn, Ford asked, "Can you build factories?" "I can build anything," the 39-year-old Albert Kahn replied. Well, Ford said, "Come over here. I want to talk to you about a new building that we're planning." And here we see Mr. Ford and Albert and James Couzens. I went over, Mr. Kahn told a friend. It was the first time I had met Mr. Ford. Mr. James Couzens, who, by the way, was Ford manager, company shareholder, and later Detroit mayor and U.S. senator. But he was with him. Back to the quote. Apparently, there'd been an argument. Couzens, Mr. Ford informed Mr. Kahn, has an architect designing our new Highland Park factory. I don't like it, and they think the kind of building I want is impossible. I want the whole thing under one roof. If you can design it that way, say so and do it, unquote. In 1929, Albert Kahn said of this first meeting, quote, "When Henry Ford took me over to the old horse racing course where the Highland Park plant stands and told me what he wanted, I thought he was crazy. No buildings such as he talked of had been known to me, but I designed them according to his ideas. I don't think it possible," Mr. Kahn reminisced, "but I didn't want to tell him that. I wanted to see what could be done." Mr. Ford was no help. He could not explain just what it was he wanted. But when I showed him my first rough drawings, he said, "You've got only part of the idea. Now do this and do that." And returning to the Kahn quote, "That's the way he's always been. I'm not finished with the first design before I realized the magnitude of his conception. And yet, even after I had finished, I had a blind spot. I suggested to him that he had vast acreage behind the plant. By the way, the original site was a 60-acre horse track. It was 93 acres eventually, with the addition of additional land. I urged him not to build the factory so close to Woodward Avenue. Why not center it, I asked. He looked at me and laughed. You still haven't got the most important part of the scheme, he said. That vacant space is for expansion. By this system, we can add on units link by link. All I ever did," Mr. Kahn modestly concluded, "was to take his instinctive hunch and reduce it to a working formula," unquote. The two men quickly forged a relationship and partnership of minds. Architecture is 90% business and 10% art, Mr. Kahn once proclaimed. Mr. Kahn, who had been trained to see the beauty in art and architecture of the past, was able to visualize beauty in the design of a factory. And here you see from Highland Park from Woodward Avenue, about 1914. According to Mr. Kahn, quote, "The problem of plant design as a rule gave scope for constructive thinking and planning, affords opportunity for exercising sound judgment and arrangement, and last but not least, it offers attractive grouping and external treatment. In regard to the latter, it is proven that a straightforward attack of the problem, the direct solution generally applied, that avoidance of unnecessary ornamentation, simplicity, and proper respect for cost of maintenance make this type, which strictly unitarian and functional, has a distinct architectural merit," unquote. In 1969, Glenn Paulson, then the president of Cranbrook Academy of Art, said of the early Ford and Kahn relationship, quote, "Ford's idea was the assembly line, a line of continuous synchronized production that would cut costs to the point where nearly every family could afford the automobile. Ford's idea took shape in the buildings that Kahn designed for him at Highland Park." And then underlined and highlighted in this quote, the existence of these two men in the same city at the same time made it almost inevitable that the auto industry should center here. Mr. Kahn's relationship with Henry, I should say, and continue out with Mr. Paulson's quote, Mr. Kahn's reaction to Henry Ford's anti-Semitism was to oppose it with his own demonstration of the Jewish ethic of honesty, modesty, and hard work, unquote. Thus began an association that would lead Mr. Kahn to design over 1,000 buildings, 1,069 to be exact, for Ford, 150 buildings for General Motors, dozens for Chrysler Corporation, about 35, and hundreds of other industrial structures in the United States and other parts of the world. By 1938, Mr. Kahn's firm was handling 19% of all of America's architecturally designed industrial buildings. By 1942, when Mr. Kahn passed away, he and his firm had designed buildings worth more than $2 billion, the majority of which were factories. Mr. Kahn's Ford Highland Park design was a breakthrough. The original building seen here under construction in 1909, was largely made of steel, concrete, and glass. Production began in this facility in January of 1910. The building's 50,000 square foot of glass let in lights, floods of sunlight on bright days, prompting some to call it the Crystal Palace. With its 4 stories, 865-foot length and 75-foot width, the structure was at the time the largest building under one roof in Michigan. The shimmering result that inspired the plant's nickname, Crystal Palace, was however not necessarily for the good of Ford workers. In Mr. Ford's constant quest to eliminate waste of motion in the workplace, he wanted to crowd machines as close together as possible. Look at this room. Following the simple logic that it takes less time and energy and work to move a finished part 2 feet rather than 10 feet. Here's another picture. Mr. Ford pointed out, quote, "You know, when you have a lot of light, you can put a lot of machines closer together," unquote. The year before the Highland Park plant opened, and only that first building where you see where it says Ford Motor Company in the lower right, that's the original section. But before Highland Park opened, American factories had produced 2 million horse-drawn carriages and 120,000 automobiles. By 1923, production of the Model T surpassed 2 million vehicles at Highland Park. That represented 57% of the cars sold in the US, 50% sold worldwide, and of all of the cars of any age in the world by that time, over half were Ford Model Ts. Additionally, the workforce at Highland Park had grown to 68,000 by 1923, and the complex expanded rapidly to include more than 3 million square feet of office space. These are postcards from my collection, by the way. Henry Ford was particularly proud of the powerhouse seen here, and no less proud of its interior, which we see an exaggerated sketch here. Among the buildings, other buildings were the administration building, a second office building, several 4-story buildings, a machine shop, and 2 6-story buildings, the roof of which was a broad expanse of ventilated skylight. This is one of the craneways inside one of the 6-story buildings. In 2008, during the Model T Centennial, I was fortunate enough to be driving the first of 52 Model Ts as we passed through this section of the building. In designing the administration building, Mr. Kahn, to the surprise of some, used the same reinforced concrete technique that he employed in the design of the factory buildings. Mr. Kahn worked with concrete with few exceptions, one of them being Detroit's Ford Service Building, that still exists on the northeast corner of Woodward and Grand Boulevard. It was built in 1910 and 8 stories high, thanks to a 4-story addition in 1913 in this postcard here. Its entire exterior was surfaced with white glazed terracotta. The building was refaced, and Mr. Kahn's exterior design was eliminated, although I used to go to unemployment hearings when the state of Michigan was there, and the interior is still the same as it was originally designed. Interestingly, the Highland Park plant, whose chief claim to fame derives from being the birthplace of the mass production in the automobile industry, was not designed for moving assembly line production. In fact, when moving assembly lines were first installed in 1913, the flow was impeded and made more expensive by Highland Park's multiple floors and buildings. Here you see the radiators and tires coming down from an upper level, along with other parts. Just as interestingly, the 1957 State Historic Mark, which still stands in front of the remaining office building, the first of 2 that commemorate the plant. And here we see William Clay Ford Sr. on crutches at the dedication in 1957. Features the title Home of the Model T, rather than something like Birthplace of Automotive Mass Production, which David Lewis and I believe would be more appropriate title and subject matter. Ironically, the same year the mark was dedicated, the plant's powerhouse and administration building were demolished, leaving a large open space fronting Woodward Avenue that would be filled in the 1990s when the Model T Plaza Shopping Center was constructed on this site. Despite the demolition and the subsequent removal of other structures, more than half of the original 3 million square foot of frontage remains today. Ford manufacturing continued at Highland Park until 1974, when trim and tractor final assembly operations were relocated. At that time, Henry Ford II announced the possibility of establishing a museum in the surviving office building seen here, but nothing came of the proposal, and the building was sold along with the rest of the complex in 1981. A variety of other proposals have been made to redevelop the Highland Park property since the sale. Known for many years as the Woodward Manchester Properties, Ford Motor Company is still the largest tenant and leases much of the complex for storages of documents, machines, and vehicles. Ford Highland Park continues to impress historians of architecture and technology, as well as others. In 1992, German filmmaker Dieter Marcello, when shooting a documentary on Kahn designed buildings in the Detroit area, Russia, and Italy, remarked of the factory, quote, "The starting point of all industry in the 20th century. It's boarded up and so totally neglected that the owner won't allow us to film inside. It would be a fantastic museum, but nobody cares about the building. That's very hard to believe," unquote. Meanwhile, a Newsweek magazine noted in 1985, quote, "The Highland Park plant, once exalted, is now a shabby memorial to American industrial history. That is an eyesore, albeit a magnificent eyesore," unquote. Highland Park's buildings, and here's right before Ford moved out in the 1980s. Highland Park buildings are slowly deteriorating, but they are no danger of falling into themselves. They were built too strong for that to happen. Indeed, one wonders if they might stand for as long as Rome's Colosseum and Athens' Parthenon, and surely they would have cared for. As he designed the Highland Park plant and subsequent plans, Mr. Kahn revealed several design hallmarks. First, he made a careful study of the flow of production. Then he provided for straight line but flexible manufacturing while incorporating generous column spacing, strong floors, and high ceilings. He also designed for minimum upkeep and low fire insurance costs. Insistent that the plants have pleasant working conditions, he made sure there was adequate heating, ventilation, natural lighting, and he was fond of saying, quote, "It costs no more to design for the welfare of the men and to make the plant bright, comfortable, and good looking as well as efficient," unquote. And here we see Highland Park again in a postcard. While designing the Highland Park plant, Mr. Kahn also began designing other Ford manufacturing and assembly plants in almost 3 dozen cities across the country. The first wave of these plants, architecturally reminiscent of Highland Park, ranged in height from 3 to 11 stories, with 4 to 5 stories being most common. Each of those plants have a rich history. Here we see Indianapolis. Here we see Fargo, North Dakota, which, by the way, the first floor is a furniture company when I was up there 5 years ago, and the top 2 floors are loft apartments. Here we see Pittsburgh as it appeared at the time of the Model T and as it appeared in the 1980s. And then finally, Cleveland. The Cleveland plant was converted into I'm sorry, that's not Cleveland, that's Oklahoma. Here's Cleveland. The Cleveland plant was converted into the Cleveland Institute of Art in the early 1980s. Joseph McCullough, president of the Institute at that time, said, quote, "Ford and Kahn built the factory to assemble Model Ts, but they really designed it for us. They didn't know it at the time, but that's how it worked out," unquote. These remarks would undoubtedly warm Albert Kahn's heart were he with us today. And so here's the Columbus plant. I could talk for an hour about these plants. I won't, I promise. But this is the Columbus plant at the Model T time. And here are the current plans to convert this building into retail and housing. While within a few years of building the multi-story Highland Park plant and the regional assembly plants, Henry Ford began to have doubts about the efficiency of multi-story factories. Too much time and energy was wasted transporting materials by elevators and even conveyors that extended between floors. Mr. Ford decided to build a self-sufficient plant that would have a continuous flow of production on one level. Albert Kahn, of course, was invited to design the first of these plants on the banks of the Rouge River. And here we see the Rouge River Center, or Rouge Center as they call it today, as it looks as at its peak. And here we see Edsel and Henry Ford studying the complex to talk about changes to it. By the time Ford began the move to the Rouge, Edsel Ford had become company secretary, and less than 2 years later, he was named company president on December 31st, 1918. About the same time as the initial construction of the Rouge began, Edsel married Eleanor Clay, J.L. Hudson, the department store chain's niece, on November 1st, 1916. Thus, Edsel joined his father in the expansion of what by then was by far the largest industrial firm in the world, and he began to take part in the meetings with Mr. Kahn. On October 16th, 1941, at a meeting of architects and engineers in St. Louis, Mr. Kahn said of Mr. Ford, quote, "The courage of Mr. Ford as shown in the development of the motor car has been evidenced equally in his factory buildings. Who but he would have had the courage to practically abandon the enormous Highland Park plant for the River Rouge development, where he has adequate room, 1,100 acres, by the way, for one-story structures, an opportunity for more economical production, as well as for bettering working conditions for his men. Proper ventilation, sanitation, air and light, safety appliances, first aid stations, all have his close and thorough consideration," unquote. Other innovations of Mr. Ford, and this, I'm sorry, continuing with Albert Kahn's quote, I'm sorry. Other innovations of Mr. Ford's are plants along waterways, making possible water shipments, and his placing of numerous smaller plants, seen here, known as the village industries, back to the quote, in rural districts in attractive settings, giving employment to farmers during the winter months, which has proven of great economic help to the respective communities and his business as well. It was also Mr. Ford who proved the advantage of decentralization, now so generally adopted. So the end of the 1941 Albert Kahn quote. The Rouge's first structure, the 1,702-foot-long B building, was built in 1917 to manufacture the submarine chasers known as Eagle boats during World War I, the same year this picture was taken. And here we see Eagle boat number 1 emerging from the B building. After World War I, the B building at the Rouge converted to the Dearborn Assembly Plant, and it was the Ford's oldest assembly plant when Ford Motor Company moved Mustang production from that building to Flat Rock in 2004. Most of the building has been torn down to make room for the current Dearborn truck plant where the F-150 is built. And now they've got the new electric center there where they're building the F-150 Lightning. Within the Rouge, Mr. Kahn, by now using less concrete and more steel, designed a number of superb buildings, plus extensive docks. Here is a huge powerhouse with its 8 smokestacks. It functioned until February 1st, 1999, when it was all but destroyed by an explosion that killed 6 employees and injured more than a dozen others. Now, near the powerhouse was the world's largest iron foundry, and here is the open hearth mill. For decades, photographers, artists, and art lovers have dotted upon the Rouge architecture, including the famous photographer Charles Sheeler, who took many of the photographs that I'm showing you today. This photograph, a postcard from my collection of the rolling mill, illustrates the wide expanses of natural light made possible by Mr. Kahn's designs. And here we see the northwest corner of the warehouse building for the steel mill, and this is the tire plant. This plant's equipment was shipped to the Soviet Union during World War II, actually to Russia, not quite the Soviet Union yet at that time. As part of the Lend-Lease program, the equipment never returned. The glass plant stands out, being described in 1974 by Kahn biographer Professor Grant Hildebrand as, quote, the single factory that carried industrial architecture forward more than any others, and probably has as much right to the term revolutionary as any building of the 20th century, with upper windows and butterfly roof encased in a simple, efficient envelope. The glass plant answered all of the problems of structure, light, and ventilation, and even the plant's detached smokestacks achieved a monumental quality, unquote. Although little publicized, Mr. Kahn also designed 7.5 miles of tunnels underneath the Rouge and beyond. Some of them were sizable. Here we see a Model A inside the 4-mile water intake tunnel that went to the Detroit River. And here we see Detroit Mayor Frank Murphy and another Model A in the same tunnel with Edsel Ford driving and Henry Ford in the back seat. It seems that Henry Ford would do almost anything for publicity. Through the years, the Rouge has been praised for its architecture. The New York Times, summing up Mr. Kahn's work in 1970, described the plant as, quote, one of the most important structures in the history of architecture in its function rather than its formalistic sense, unquote. In 1994, Smithsonian Magazine observed that Mr. Kahn, quote, responding to Mr. Ford's vision, accomplished his most startling breakthrough. He designed the prototypical 20th century factory, unquote. The Rouge has been greatly downsized. This is a 1980s photograph, and there's even more buildings gone since then. Of the 34 original plants, only a handful remain. Of the major Kahn designs, only the Dearborn stamping plant, where I worked during college, Dearborn engine plant, a frame plant, and the Dearborn tool and die plant remain. Steel operations were incorporated into a separate Ford subsidiary in 1981 named Rouge Steel, and were sold in 1989. Russian steelmaker Severstal purchased this 600-acre section of the Rouge immediately after Rouge Steel filed for bankruptcy in 2003. Severstal subsequently sold the facilities to AK Steel, which was acquired by Cleveland Cliffs Corporation in 2020. But many Kahn buildings in that area or Kahn structures remain. Adjacent to the Rouge was the company's former administration building on Schaefer Road, in which Henry Ford, Edsel Ford, and then Henry Ford II had offices between 1928 and 1956. This building was to have been extensively remodeled and put into a new use by Ford after the company's parts and service division moved to the Renaissance Center and elsewhere in 1992, but it remained vacant and was torn down in 1997. Some of you may remember it was adjacent to I-94, right at the Rotunda exit from the freeway. Mr. Kahn also designed a variety of other buildings for Henry Ford, including the Clara B. Ford Nurses Home at Henry Ford Hospital's main campus on West Grand Boulevard, which, by the way, is offices today. And they say that each office has its own bathroom because it was a nurses' home, of course. And the handsome Dearborn Inn, one of the world's first airport motels, despite the state historic marker indicating it is. Oakland, California's airport motel opened a month earlier. The inn's owner is once again Ford Motor Company, and it's operated by the Marriott Corporation. The inn at the bottom of this photo of the Ford Airport, the Edison Institute Museum in Greenfield Village, is a beautiful building to this day. In addition, Mr. Kahn designed Ford's exposition building at the Michigan State Fair and its exhibit at the Chicago World's Fair, including the pavilion's rotunda, which was moved to Dearborn across from the Ford Administration Building in 1936, and it served as a gateway to the Rouge until being destroyed by fire November the 9th, 1962. The rotunda, famed for its Christmas shows, attracted as many as 1.5 million visitors between 1953 and 1962. Mr. Kahn also designed Ford's pavilion at New York World's Fair in 1839, shown at the bottom right of this picture, and here's a postcard of that building. An aerial futuristic highway, not so futuristic today, almost looks like the old ramp up to the roof of Cobo Hall, allowed visitors to ride in new Ford cars when they visited the fair. Mr. Kahn also designed Ford's Iron Mountain, Michigan wood processing complex. The facility passed through several hands after Ford sold it in 1951, but unlike Highland Park, all the buildings have now been demolished. Additionally, Mr. Kahn designed many Ford plants outside the United States, including Dagenham, 15 miles outside London, and this is very reminiscent, like a small-scale Rouge. And here's Copenhagen, Denmark, which is very representative of other overseas Kahn designed buildings for Ford. And here we see Mr. Kahn's Ford Yokohama plant as it looked in the 1930s. Ford also had built plants designed by Mr. Kahn in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and other Latin American countries. When planning the Dearborn Engineering Laboratory in the 1920s, shown here, Mr. Kahn was told by Mr. Ford that he wanted a building in which he could design a pin, a little tiny pin, or a railroad locomotive. He got what he wanted, complete with a crane that could lift 50 tons. And here we see the engineering laboratory building above or behind the Edison Institute Museum, which was renamed the Henry Ford Museum after Henry Ford's death, which was, by the way, the museum was built later, but designed by Robert O'Derrick. The building's doors opened wide enough to accommodate a rail freight car, and the interior was subsequently versatile enough to accommodate not only Mr. Ford's engineering activities, but also dancing parties, laboratory for tomato juice extract from the Ford farms, and the staff, unfortunately, of Mr. Ford's national newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. Additionally, his pioneering radio station, WW1, from the early 1920s, shown here. I doubt any Kahn designed building has been asked to do more than this one. Completed in 1925, the Dearborn Engineering Laboratory was known as EEE, Engine and Electrical Engineering Building, for many years, and then POE, Powertrain Engineering, Operations Engineering, Engine Engineering Building. It's an exceptional example of the classical influence upon Mr. Kahn's industrial architectural design. Recently, the building was restored and once again full of engineers, at least when they're not working from home due to the pandemic. There is a persistent rumor that it will be donated to the Henry Ford once the nearby Ford Research and Engineering Center is fully renovated and converted to a Henry Ford Museum Annex or collection storage building. Don't quote me on that. I know a lot of people are listening. Even the building's powerhouse is classical, and to this day is favorably impresses motorists driving along Michigan Avenue. For those you know Dearborn, I took this photo last month from the parking lot of Ford's Garage Restaurant on Michigan Avenue. Dearborn Engineering Laboratory's attractive interior proved quite suitable for ballroom dancing, and not least because its pipes and conduits were concealed in beams and columns. The interior also had an abundance of natural light, as you can see. Mr. Kahn also designed Ford's aviation hangars and the adjacent manufacturing plant in which the Ford Trimotor, the leading passenger airplane of the late 1920s and early 1930s, was built. Ford Motor Company was the largest airplane producer from 1926 to 1932. Here's a great photograph, aerial photograph of the hangar and the factory in the upper right with Greenfield Village, the Edison Institute Museum, and the Engineering Laboratory. down to the bottom, and you can even see the powerhouse for the laboratory there at the bottom left. Although Mr. Kahn accepted almost all Ford assignments, he occasionally drew the line. When asked, for example, to design a log cabin clubhouse for the Dearborn Country Club, he told Mr. Ford's secretary, quote, "I never build any log houses. I think I'd rather not have anything to do with it," unquote. Subsequently, he designed this attractive logless Dearborn Country Club. With the coming of World War II, Mr. Kahn designed numerous naval bases and war plants. His biggest single wartime project, indeed the largest project ever, was Ford's Willow Run plant, completed in 1942, the year of the architect's passing. The factory covered 70 acres, and its main plant was 3,200 feet long and 1,280 feet wide, making it the world's largest plant at the time of its completion, surpassed by a plant in Chicago a year later. Because of the threat of air attack, Willow Run was artificially illuminated, reversing Mr. Kahn's practice of providing maximum daylight. The factory was the first to mass produce 4-engine bombers, the product at this plant being the B-24, the Liberator, as the British called it. The Willow Run plant was the last great project on which Mr. Kahn and Mr. Ford worked together. For many years, it was occupied by General Motors' Hydromatic Transmission Division. Most of the plant was demolished in 2014 to make room for the American Center for Mobility, which is focused on developing and testing autonomous vehicles. Now, you might wonder why Dodge Main is here, but let me explain this. Mr. Kahn built well. As mentioned previously, none of his buildings will fall upon themselves, not least because where one expects to see 6 inches of concrete, there are 12. Consequently, it is almost cost prohibitive to tear down many Kahn designed buildings, which helps explain why so many stand to this day. In 1980, when Dodge Main came down, Rodney White, General Superintendent of M&M Contracting, one of Detroit's leading demolition companies at the time, stated that demolishing Dodge Main, shown here, he said, quote, Mr. Kahn built, he said Albert Kahn, I'm sorry, built almost all of his buildings like fortresses. They're super reinforced, and they're really well constructed. You really have to pound on them, get them to come down, unquote. Certainly, Henry Ford's relationship with Mr. Kahn was based on his respect for the architect's talents and concentration, determination, and ability to listen to and translate ideas into reality. Mr. Kahn always said that he was a listener during his meetings with Henry Ford, but it is clear that in addition to implementing Mr. Ford's directives, he offered many suggestions. Henry Ford and Albert Kahn, seen here with let's see, Curtis Martin and Ford executive Charles Sorensen, shared many traits, which helps explain the durability of the relationship. Each had little formal education and were prejudiced against college graduates and so-called experts. Each was visionary and highly capable, but somewhat inarticulate, with shortcomings, sometimes leading Mr. Kahn to express himself to Mr. Ford in the form of drawings. Both were practical, enthusiastic, energetic, and stubborn, and reveled in challenges. Both were undisputed leaders of their respective businesses and insisted on having subordinates who, while capable of original solutions, were willing to accept the boss's final decision. Neither wanted nor kept staff members who sought public recognition rivaling their own. Finally, both men detested smoking with a passion. Mr. Ford's respect for Mr. Kahn's abilities explains why the industrialist and anti-Semite retained the Jewish architect even while publicly crusading against Jews. Mr. Kahn had worked for Mr. Ford for more than a decade prior to the launching of the industrialist anti-Semitic program in 1920. The timing is important because one has to wonder whether Mr. Ford would have hired Mr. Kahn in the wake of the anti-Jewish outburst. Mr. Kahn, for his part, never locked horns with Mr. Ford on any issue, including the magnate's anti-Semitism. As a consequence, the architect was one of the few Jews close to Mr. Ford who did not break with the automaker in the 1920s. In contrast, Mr. Ford's Edison Avenue neighbor, by the way, Clara and Henry Ford lived at 66, now 140 Edison in the Boston Edison district from 1908 to 1915 when they moved to Fairlane. And closest Jewish friend, Temple Bethel's Rabbi Leo K. Franklin, seen here with Mr. Ford, who before 1920 annually accepted a complimentary Model T from Mr. Ford, rejected subsequent offer of cars, and practically terminated their friendship. Like other Jews, Mr. Kahn was puzzled and hurt by Mr. Ford's accusations against members of his ethnicity and faith, but he kept his feelings to himself. David Lewis and I both believe that Mr. Kahn correctly thought that Mr. Ford's anti-Semitism was rooted in ignorance rather than deep-seated bigotry or malice, and that neither he nor anyone else could alter this sad flaw in Mr. Ford's character. Here we see Mr. Ford accepting the top German civilian medal, the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, from Hitler's emissaries for his birthday, 75th birthday in July 1938. It is interesting to note the German consul general from Cleveland, who was pinning it on Mr. Ford, said, Mr. Ford, quote, is receiving it for his humanitarian ideas and devotion to the cause of peace, just as the Fuhrer and Chancellor has done, unquote. Hadn't they already taken over Austria by that time? Well, that's another story for another time. Here we see the Automotive Hall of Fame banner honoring Mr. Kahn when he was inducted into the hall in 2012 for, quote, as you see along the top, brick and mortar rather than engines and transmissions, unquote. In 1929, Mr. Kahn signed a contract with Russia to plan and supervise construction of a series of manufacturing buildings on the American model. The initial contract was for a $4 million tractor plant in Leningrad. Learning of the deal, Detroit Free Press reporter William C. Richards asked Mr. Kahn what he thought Mr. Ford was going to say. Mr. Kahn's eyes, according to Richards, twinkled and he remarked, "You tell me," unquote. The next morning, Mr. Kahn received a call from Henry Ford. 13 years later, Mr. Kahn commented on that phone call, thereby making his only documented outside the family reference to Mr. Ford's anti-Semitism. Mr. Kahn's first thought upon receiving the call was that Mr. Ford planned to dismiss him because, quote, he rationalized Mr. Ford had once had prejudice against Jews, unquote. Two, that Soviet Jews were being accused of fostering communism, and that, quote, he, Mr. Kahn, may be regarded as a tool of Russian Jews. In Mr. Kahn's words, he feared, quote, that Mr. Ford and I had reached a parting of ways, unquote. Indeed, instead, Mr. Ford told Mr. Kahn, quote, "That's fine, Mr. Kahn. I want you to do all that you can to help the Russians. Can you come out this morning and talk it over with me?" Unquote. Mr. Kahn remained fearful about Mr. Ford's reactions. Here you see Henry and Clara Ford with their son Edsel. At the subsequent meeting, however, Mr. Ford simply told Mr. Kahn, "Tell the Russians that, quote, I can help them in any way I can. They can have all of my patterns, designs, models, everything we've got in the way of technical knowledge is theirs for the asking. I will not charge them a cent," unquote. The architect went on to design 521 buildings for the Russians. One can only speculate as to whether or not Mr. Kahn would have pushed forward with the Russians if he had to choose between Ford and Russia. Following a Free Press story which quoted Mr. Ford's remarks, Mr. Kahn received a verification call from the Russian Trade Commissioner stationed in New York City. Upon being assured that the story was true, the Russians arranged to visit Dearborn to negotiate with Henry Ford and his executives. Eventually, the Ford Motor Company cooperated mightily with the Russians, not only in sending engineers to Russia, but welcoming Russian trainees to the Rouge plant. On that occasion, Mr. Kahn impacted on Henry Ford rather than the other way around. One must wonder if the Russians could have survived the German attack during World War II without the products that came from these Albert Kahn design factories. Henry Ford and Albert Kahn, it may be further noted, seldom have ever met socially, but Mr. Kahn was the only Jewish guest at Edsel and Eleanor Ford's house for Clara and Henry Ford's 50th wedding anniversary at Gawthorne Point in 1938. And speaking of the Ford house, while designing the Edsel and Eleanor Ford house, Mr. Kahn spent far more time with the younger Fords than he'd ever had with Henry Ford. Moreover, both Edsel Ford and Albert Kahn had great respect for each other. Thus, entrusting their home to Mr. Kahn speaks of Edsel and Eleanor Ford's esteem for the architect. As for Mr. Kahn's opinion of Edsel, we have a 1985 statement from Mr. Kahn's son, Dr. Edgar Kahn. Quote, "I think that my father had a higher regard for Edsel Ford than any other man that he knew outside of his family," unquote. Speaking of Ford House, Edsel Ford sent Albert Kahn to the Cotswold district of England to see if he could adapt a Cotswold design into a home for his family. Edsel Ford's only directive was that he wanted a modest, picturesque home rather than a palace. The design that Kahn developed was nothing short of spectacular. It's 60 rooms. It has 60 rooms, but many say that it retains the style and charm of the tiny three-room Cotswold cottage that were so common then. I'm sure everyone watching tonight agrees that this home is modest at 30,000 square feet, by the way. When Edsel Ford was introduced to Mr. Kahn through his association with the Ford Motor Company, their close relationship, though, developed through their mutual interest in the Detroit Institute of Arts. In a special election in 1918, the residents of Detroit approved a new city charter, which, among other things, established a municipal art commission and planned for a new and larger museum shown here. James Cousins, Henry Ford's one-time business manager and major Ford shareholder, was mayor of Detroit at the time. He appointed Albert Kahn as a museum trustee. And then in 1923, 5 years later, the president of the Arts Commission was Ralph Booth, an art connoisseur, longtime supporter of the arts in Detroit, and a close friend of Edsel. He urged then Detroit Mayor John Smith to invite Edsel to join the Arts Commission. Thus, Edsel Ford did so, and 6 years later was elected the president of the Arts Commission, a position he held for 13 years until his untimely death. In 1932, a $10,000 contract was signed with Diego Rivera to paint murals in the garden court at the DIA at the time when the museum staff had been cut to the bone during the Great Depression. The project only moved forward because Edsel Ford not only paid the entire cost of the murals, but the entire cost of the salaries of the museum staff for the entire year of 1932. And here we see Diego Rivera's inclusion of Edsel Ford and Dr. Valentiner in the mural. In October 1932, Albert Kahn wrote a letter to DIA director, Dr. William Valentiner, concerning the murals. Quote, "The museum seems to be operating, of course, on a very restricted scale. The most exciting matter at the museum just now is Rivera's work. The upper frieze is almost completed, though the work on the lower panels has not yet begun. I happened to see John Carroll last Saturday," and let me step out of the quote for a second and say, John Carroll was a prominent local artist who gave Edsel Ford personal art lessons. And back to Mr. Kahn's quote. "He was wildly enthusiastic about the work so far. Carroll tells me Rivera is very enthusiastic about the opportunity, which no doubt accounts for the extremely low price he made us. His man told me last week that Rivera had just been commissioned with one mural for Radio City, the one that was later removed because Lenin was included in the painting. Not as large as the one of our big panels for which he is being paid. So for Radio City, he's being paid $22,000. Finishing Mr. Kahn's quote, "At that, I dare say he will be less interested in this work than he is than what he is doing for our museum," unquote. And here we see a separate Diego Rivera painting of Edsel Ford. Accusations were made that Edsel Ford devised the murals as an advertisement for the Ford Motor Company. When Edsel Ford was asked how he could, quote, have such defamation of the walls of the museum, unquote, he simply replied, "I like Rivera's work." Speaking of the murals, and here we see Albert Kahn with Diego Rivera and his wife, Rita Kahlo. Mr. Kahn said, quote, "Instead of criticism, there should be peons of praise. These frescoes are a great credit to the painter and to the Detroit industrialist Edsel Ford, who believes in the poetry and beauty of industry. To reveal that poetry and beauty, Edsel Ford engaged the man most qualified in the world to bring out the poetry and beauty in industry. He has put Detroit on the map artistically," unquote. A decade later, an era ended for the DIA, Detroit, and for all of us. The museum lost two of its greatest supporters within 6 months of each other. Albert Kahn was the only member of the original Arts Commission still serving when he died in 1942. And then Edsel Ford died on May 26, 1943. It is believed that stress from work contributed to Mr. Kahn's death. He had been confined for several weeks with an illness that began as a cold and developed into a bronchial ailment. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Please correct me if I'm wrong on some of these things. He died on December 8th, 1942 at the age of 73. David Lewis and I believe the same could be said of the death of Edsel Ford, young age of 49. Although Edsel succumbed to stomach cancer, a doctor who had examined Edsel in 1942 said that they could have removed a portion of Edsel's stomach had he stopped working on war production and come to them earlier. In a talk that Mr. Kahn gave in Detroit shortly before his death, he said, quote, "Industrial architecture has continued its forward march, contributing not only its share to the great welfare, but winning recognition, even in the field of art, which I dare say was perhaps the last it hoped for. But who would deny that great expanses of glass, for instance, essential and modern industrial buildings, have not exerted their influence on everyday buildings, even the residential work? Or who would question that the entire field of architecture has been influenced by today's common sense solution to the factory building. Albert Kahn's funeral was held at Temple Bethel on Woodward Avenue in Detroit that he himself had designed in 1927. Today is Bonsdale Theater. Outside the temple after the funeral, a Detroit news reporter stopped Henry Ford. "What's your memories of Albert Kahn?" the reporter asked Mr. Ford. Mr. Ford said, quote, "Albert Kahn was one of the best men that I ever knew. The fruits of his genius are in every part of the world. He's a man of fine taste, a soul of integrity, a public-spirited citizen, and absolutely loyal to principle. He will be missed as a man and a helper of great enterprises." Hanging, and you'll be surprised by this, I know I was, when John King was trying to sell this to me at John King Books 40 years ago. Hanging in Mr. Kahn's office at the time was this inscribed photograph of Henry Ford. His signature and handwritten text on the photograph say, "To Albert Kahn, your best friend is the one who brings out the best in you," unquote. To the last, Albert Kahn was baffled by Henry Ford, seen here with Edsel Ford at the Rouge during the construction of the Albert Kahn designed Dearborn stamping plant. Shortly before his death, of course, Albert Kahn said, quote, "He's a strange man. He seems to feel always that he is being guided by someone outside himself. With simplicity of a farm hands discussing the year's crops or season's crops, he makes vast moves," unquote. Understandably, Mr. Kahn felt insecure with Henry Ford, who's not only an anti-Semite, but unpredictable. In 1923, when the Kahn organization was doing more work for the Ford Motor Company than ever before, Mr. Kahn wrote his vacationing wife, Ernestine, quote, "Whether we can hold them," meaning Ford, "is of course always a question. We'll try our darndest," unquote. Mr. Kahn's darndest obviously proved good enough, and as he and his firm continued to design factories for the Ford Motor Company for the rest of his life, and of course to this day. The following statement about Albert Kahn is worth quoting. To W. Hawkins Ferry, the author of the book, The Legacy of Albert Kahn, quote, "Albert Kahn was the bearer of one of the great names in the history of American architecture, who did for the factory what Louis Sullivan did for the skyscraper, of what Mr. Wright," speaking of Frank Lloyd Wright, "did for the private residence," unquote. And speaking of Mr. Wright, for Frank Lloyd Wright, Albert Kahn was a designer of, quote, "beautiful buildings, beautifully lighted with sun shining into them," unquote. I like to think Mr. Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright, was speaking of the Kahn designed buildings at Ford's Highland Park and Rouge and beyond. Mr. Kahn is memorialized in many ways. One of them is his office, which was since 1983 has been available to researchers at Lawrence Tech Institute of Technology in Southfield. In addition to some 3,000 books on permanent loan, the institution, the museum, or the library, I'm sorry, includes, I think of it as a museum, I've been there a few times, it's wonderful. Includes warm walnut paneling, bookcases, and heavy doors from Mr. Kahn's office. In this room, Mr. Kahn met with Henry Ford, Walter B. Chrysler, and numerous other important clients. In 1938, just 4 years before his death, the Kahn staff numbered nearly 600. The firm was responsible for 19% of all architectural design industrial buildings in this country alone at that time, and he had designed 22% of the University of Michigan collegiate buildings then in use. As of 2006, I should add, 60 Albert Kahn buildings were listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and 15 Albert Kahn buildings are recognized by official state historic markers. They include the Dearborn Inn, Edsel and Eleanor Ford House in Willow Run. Henry Ford followed Albert Kahn and his son in death on April 7th, 1947. He was 83 years old. Here we see Mr. Ford's Highland Park office, which was later reconstructed, at least a portion of it, in the Henry Ford Museum. As we all know, the business relationship between Ford Motor Company and Albert Kahn Associates continues to this day. And in 1991, the Princeton Architectural Press published this book entitled Albert Kahn, Architect of Ford. I hope you've enjoyed this review of the significant relationship between three men that were so important, not only to Detroit, but also the world during the first half of the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. Again, if everyone wants to submit their questions via the chat feature, we will get to as many as we can over the next 15 minutes or so. And I will be sure to send Mike's email out to all of you tomorrow so that if you don't get your question answered, he can answer it for you himself. Let's see. Any questions? If you could just submit them via the chat feature. Was the Fisher building one of Albert Kahn's building as well?
Yeah, most definitely. It's a Albert Kahn design, of course, for the Fisher brothers, who were major shareholders in the General Motors Corporation.
Was Kahn a religious Jew or observant to any degree?
Boy, from what I've read, he wasn't deeply involved with his religion, but I'm not the right person to answer that question. If you can send that question to me, I will find more information.
Okay, so for the person who asked that question, if you could just send that directly to Mike when you have his email, that would be great. Was Henry Ford upset that Kahn worked with competitors such as Chrysler?
No, and I think that's shown in his work for the Russians. Henry Ford almost very seldom patented things and very seldom held a design back from even competitors. So no, not at all. I never have seen anything that said that he was concerned about Mr. Kahn working for General Motors or Chrysler or anyone else.
Where was Albert Kahn's walnut covered office located?
It would have been in the Albert Kahn designed New Center building known as the Albert Kahn building for many years, and now being converted into condos and retail. And Albert Kahn and Associates were in that building until a half dozen years ago when they moved over to the Fisher building.
Did you mention where Mr. Kahn lived in his lifetime?
I don't know early on, but the Albert Kahn's residence for a couple of decades at least is on the southeast corner of Mack and John R. and the Urban League of Detroit is housed there. There's a beautiful art gallery that the Kahns added to the back. He also had a home in Oakland County on Walnut Lake that was like a country house that he spent a lot of time at.
How many of Albert Kahn's buildings are still up, and how many have been torn down?
Boy, that when it comes to Ford Motor Company, of the 1,069, about 2/3 of them still exist. But when it comes to the thousands of others, that would be a question for Albert Kahn and Associates.
Could you give us an example of something that maybe you're still looking to learn about Albert Kahn? Any new historical documents that you hope you might be able to explore, anything like that?
Well, Albert Kahn Associates, the firm has an extensive library. And then, of course, much has been given to Lawrence Tech. I'm more of a Ford historian than a Kahn historian, but I certainly appreciate his buildings. And I'm a huge architectural buff for the Detroit area. So I'm constantly looking things up about Kahn-related buildings, but I'm not sure that answers the question. But if you have a further question, please email me.
Did Albert Kahn socialize with Edsel Ford?
It seems like he did. Besides Henry and Clara Ford's 50th wedding anniversary in April of 1938, there's at least two other occasions when he went to parties at Gawker Point after being invited by Edsel and Eleanor. And then, as I mentioned, during the design of their home, he spent extensive time with the Fords. Of course, Albert Kahn designed in 1915 the Detroit Athletic Club, of which Henry and Edsel Ford were members. The membership invited Mr. Kahn, but being would have been one of the first Jewish members, he declined. So I don't know that there were any clubs that he met with Henry and Edsel Ford at, but the Edsel Fords would have seen him at a lot of events. Henry Ford, although a billionaire, was really a common man and didn't attend a lot of those type of things. So I would think it'd be more of Edsel Ford than Henry Ford that would have met with Albert Kahn socially.
Given that his father was a rabbi, what did his parents think of his work?
I don't know that. I can find that out, just email me. But his father didn't live that many more years after his firm became large, and I'm not sure, but his mother did. So I can find that out. Please send me that question.
Did Kahn ever attempt to talk to Ford about his anti-Semitism?
There's nothing recorded to that point, and I tend to believe that it is something that he avoided. After the 92 articles in 20 and 21 in the Dearborn Independent, the International Jew, or the Jew, the world's foremost problem, as many were titled, Kahn did go to Henry Ford's office 2 times that I know of after that, but would send subordinates many times after that. And I think that he not necessarily avoided Henry Ford, but was less close to him after that.
Where is Albert Kahn buried?
He's not. He's in the Whitechapel Cemetery, in that huge mausoleum that you see as you're going up I-75. And I was surprised to find that he was cremated. There's a little bronze box in the center on a shelf about eye level. He and his wife were both cremated.
That's surprising, given their religion.
Yeah, in 1941 or 42, would that have been common in the Jewish religion to be cremated?
I don't believe cremation is common in general in the Jewish religion.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. That's why I was shocked. Now, if you go to Woodmere Cemetery, which you look at the Rouge as you're there, that's where Julius Kahn and his wife are, in the Jewish section of that cemetery. But Albert and his wife, for some reason, were cremated.
A personal question for you. How did you become passionate about cars and architecture?
In the 5th grade, Sister Virginia asked us to do a book report on a Michigander, and I picked up a 1950 children's book called Henry Ford Engineer. My dad was a sound man for WJBK, and then WJBK radio, and then television for 38 years when it was a CBS affiliate. And he was very passionate about Detroit history. And it just kind of it became an obsession after that, Ford and Detroit history in general.
Is there any involvement of Albert Kahn and Associates with the train station now?
I have not seen any at all. No. That's another question. If you want to send it to me, I can add John Cole, who is on the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation board. I just saw him at Piquette today at the Ford Piquette Avenue Plant. He could answer that question, or someone else from their staff, but I'll get the answer for you.
A 2-part question. What do you know of Kahn's design of the Country Club of Detroit in Grosse Pointe, and did Edsel have anything to do with it?
Edsel did not. And of course, it was originally designed by Field, Hinchman and Smith, and then burned 2 years later, and Albert Kahn designed it. But there were other Grosse Pointers, including the Booth from the DIA, that appreciated his work, and he'd already designed other structures in the Grosse Pointes. And so I'm sure there were many other people that were involved in asking him to design that.
What can be done about the Highland Park Assembly Plant building on Woodward today? A lot of people are upset to see it in its current state.
Woodward Avenue Action Association purchased it, and we're going to put their offices there. But it was a project, or it was a organization that promoted Woodward Avenue in Wayne County and Oakland County. And L. Brooks Patterson said, "I'm not putting money into something in Wayne County," and that killed that project. So it's passed on to others. I understand it may be for sale soon. If you're talking about that remaining office building, it contains a lot of asbestos, reinforced concrete, fortunately, so it won't fall down very soon. But it would cost millions to restore it, and probably is cost prohibitive. The rest of the facility, when we drove through in 2008 Model Ts, Ford had 56,000 skids of paper records, was what we were told. Ford Motor Company did. And then they had vehicles, and they had machinery that had been removed from factories, obviously, stacked up all over the place. So they were still the largest tenant. You're going back 14 years. I understand from a manager over there that they still are one of the largest tenants, but there's several floors of the 6-story buildings now that are empty. And while it would be great to rehab that, there's still over 1.5 million square feet left there. And I don't know who's looking for a 6-story building in Highland Park right now. I can't imagine that mainly because of it being multi-story, that it has much demand. People asking for it.
One last question. Could you please elaborate or comment on the Kahn and Associates relationship right now with the Ford Piquette plant?
Yes, thank you. Ford Piquette Avenue Plant, when we acquired the building in 2000, or when the group acquired the building in 2000, we had General Linen in the front half of the building. They moved out in May. So one of our current projects is a restoration, including a recreation of James Cousins' office and several other offices in that area. And Albert Kahn Associates are involved in that. We also, I'm sure many of you know Peter Cummings. They purchased 3 or 4 years ago, now I'm losing track, of the attached Studebaker building. Ford moved out in 1910, sold the facility to Studebaker, an 1852 wagon maker who had gone into the automobile business as they expanded into Detroit. They, in 1926, attached a very significant reinforced concrete Albert Kahn designed building. Several years ago, the group that owns Piquette split the water off from that building, but never split the electrical off. And so Albert Kahn is working with DTE and others in what is amounting to over a $1.3 million project to split that electrical off. So Albert Kahn Associates, although Piquette was designed by Field Hinchman Smith, today Smith Group, Albert Kahn beat them in the quote for the current work.
Well, thank you, Mike, for a wonderful presentation this evening.
Great.
I know that everybody really, really enjoyed it. Again, if we did not get to your question, I apologize. There were so many people on the Zoom and they were coming in fast and furious, but we will be sending Mike's email address out to everyone tomorrow as a follow-up. So you will have a chance to get in touch with him and ask any questions you may still need answered.
And if I may have a couple seconds,
Mhm.
we have about 60 cars, vehicles on display at Piquette. We're open from 10 to 4 Thursday through Sunday. We have wedding receptions there, as you see, corporate events, and I urge you to contact me about touring the plant too. So I want to thank everyone, and please consider joining the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation and the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan. I'm a member of both, and they're both great organizations. They offer programs much better than this one all the time. So I think it's well worth a membership in both. Thank you.
Well, I think I speak for everyone on this Zoom tonight when I say this was a pretty amazing program, and we really, really appreciate you doing this for us. And that tour is wonderful. We had a very abridged version on this year's J Cycle, and it was one of the highlights of the route. Thank you again, Mike, for everything. As I
Thanks,
said
everyone.
before, we will send Mike's email address out tomorrow, and we hope that you will all join us again very soon on one of our upcoming programs or in person on April 25th at Beth Am Synagogue. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.